9 a.m. on the West Coast, noon on the East Coast, and in Kabul, it is 8:30 p.m., only a few hours after we got reports that there were two explosions followed by gunfire at the Kabul airport, in which there were multiple casualties, among them Americans. Welcome back to the Foreign Desk podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari. Today, we are joined by roving reporter Hollie McKay, a friend, a colleague, investigative journalist, war crimes investigator. She was a prolific writer for Fox News Digital for many, many years. And now she's globetrotting and taking on very brave freelance assignments, which brought her to Afghanistan. And now she is in Uzbekistan, where she joins us live. Welcome to the show, Hollie.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Obviously, I think people are very interested in what you were doing on the ground in Afghanistan during this crisis, how you got there, and how this all came about.
Absolutely. So I've been covering Afghanistan for several years and have been here several times. And I guess now my photographer, Jake Simkin, who is in Australia, we decided that this would be the ideal time to come back, really, because both of us had spent time here. We wanted to document that final phase of the U.S. Withdrawal, and we had planned to be here for about 3 months and came at the beginning of August. And really, if someone had told me that things were going to escalate as fast as they did, I would never have believed them. So we got to Kabul and we're working there, and it was the same city that I'd come to know and love. Obviously, people were a little bit more fearful this time, given that the US was leaving and what was going to happen. But we continued to work. Things seemed normal. We decided to go to Mazar Sharif, and that was the Thursday before last. And we're doing some work there on the front line with some of the SF commandos, Afghan SF commandos, and just documenting sort of what was happening around the north, as at that point, everything seemed to be falling apart. And now, mind you, Mazar Sharif is an extremely anti-Taliban stronghold. So we really didn't think that it was going to be problematic. And every intel source that I spoke to and people on the ground, it just seemed life was fairly normal. And then, so that was on the Thursday that we arrived. The next day, things seemed a little bit different. The streets were a little bit quieter. People were starting to seem a little bit more anxious, but yet things were still going. I was still in the streets, still doing interviews, still moving around. Saturday came and it was suddenly a ghost town, and you sort of only really saw people that were lining up at the banks to get all their money out. Everybody seemed to be fleeing. I was calling different interpreters that I knew, and everybody I knew had fled to Kabul at that point. And sort of by the midday, we started to see people coming in from the edges of the city and right into the city because they were being taken over by the Taliban. And we got in a cab and were driving along this sort of barren road out to talk to some of the people that were fleeing inside. And the cab driver just sort of turned around and he looked at us and he said, "I'm scared. I don't want to go any further." And the interpreter, with this strange big smile, said to me, "Oh, they broke through the first lines. We're surrounded and they're coming." And even at that point, I don't think we really, it just seemed like such an anti-Taliban stronghold. It was hard for me to wrap my head around the city falling that quickly. And yet a few hours later, by that evening, we'd gone out. We both felt, my photographer and I both felt something was very wrong. And so we hurried back to our hotel. And as we're hurrying back, you saw the Taliban come in on motorcycles. And that's when we realized, oh, okay, now we're entering a bit of a different phase. So then we had to kind of mitigate over the next few days what we were going to do in terms of getting out. Kabul had fallen the following day, so that made that the airport situation was pretty much next to impossible to get to. So yeah, in the end, we decided the only way out was really to speak to the Taliban, and that was going to be the only safe recourse, I think, for us to get out. Yeah. I was fairly confident that they weren't going to hurt a foreigner in any way, but it still was a risk with reward. And in the end, we had them work with the Uzbek consulate a little bit and take us north to the border to Uzbekistan, because at that point we could not get to Kabul as much as we wanted to. So that was sort of our adventure. And the Taliban really tried to spin this PR thing that they were different to the Taliban that existed 20 years ago, and that a lot of what was being reported in the media was propaganda. But when we started to probe a little bit more about what this new quote unquote Taliban looked like, it was very clear that they were advocating a very stringent version of Sharia law, and things, especially for women, were not going to be as rosy as it seems from a lot of their top leadership. So
Right.
It's still a little bit unclear exactly it's very contradictory, I guess. In we see the leadership saying one thing, but the actual fighters on the ground are behaving in a very different way. So it's going to be very interesting come next Tuesday when the US finally leaves exactly what this new Taliban looks like.
So many questions, and that's why I'm not interrupting you, because everything you're saying obviously is extremely interesting and really eye-opening as to what you experience and what people are experiencing there. I guess two of the things where my ears perked up is that, was there a directive for people to head to Kabul? Because it ended up being a more dangerous path for many, whether they were ending up at the airport or in the perimeters, the roads leading to the airport. That's my first question. And second, how many people are like you, in the sense that you are an American, with American citizenship, and coming over to Afghanistan, wanting to get out, and then you pursue a conversation with the Taliban to get a special permission. Are there many people, or many foreigners like yourself, that were allowed this special permission? And how easy is it to get into Uzbekistan right now?
So first question is, I think people were fleeing to Kabul because people still thought it was safe. And I know in Mazar, when I was interviewing shopkeepers the day before it fell, they were all sort of saying, we want to go somewhere safe, like Europe or Kabul, was sort of the answer they gave me. So people really thought there was just no way that Kabul was going to fall. And even if the rest of the country fell, people just did not think that Kabul was going to fall anytime soon. So that to them was a safe haven. So I don't think there was any directive. I just think people were going to wherever they could go to that they thought was going to be safe and away from some of the fighting and the Taliban. I think people thought that it was going to hold, and people just really didn't have any idea that the president was going to flee and hand it over to the Taliban, essentially. So I don't think there was a specific directive other than that was the survival mechanism. And second to that, there are some journalists, and I think that many of the journalists, such as myself, and there's been some really amazing reporting from CNN, Clarissa Ward, and there's some other, and Al Jazeera, I'm blanking on her name, Charlotte, I think she's in there doing reporting. So there's a lot of foreign women in there that are reporting and having relations with the Taliban at the same time. So I think that's an important part of what it's going to look like in this foreign landscape, is that we need to be able to understand what the Taliban is thinking, what they're doing, and how they're going to govern. So, for example, today we spoke to another Taliban leader. He's the cultural minister. And I asked him, as a foreigner, can foreign journalists still work in Afghanistan after next Tuesday? What is going to be the policy? And he seemed to be fairly certain that foreigners were still allowed to function and work there. They were still trying to set up travel mechanisms, so to speak, but their whole objective, at least what they're saying on the surface, is that they're trying to be somewhat open, and they don't want to be the pariah country that they were 20 years ago. But again, it's so hard to know. Because, what they say is so different to what they act.
Exactly. And I guess that's my follow-up, is to say, when they're saying one thing, obviously they are very savvy in using these platforms and being quoted. I'm seeing, mainstream media outlets, giving details about this morning's explosions, and then saying, as per a Taliban spokesperson, meaning our solid and trusted sources on the ground now are the Taliban spokespeople. It makes no sense. When they're telling Afghan women to stop going to university in a province like Herat, or if they're telling women in the banking industry and other industries stop going to work. Do you feel safe as a woman journalist working there past Tuesday's deadline? I know you're headed back to Afghanistan in the next 24 hours, right?
Yeah, so it's a piece by piece minute. I think to some degree, I think operating in Kabul is potentially a little bit safer. Certainly in Mazar, even though there wasn't violence and the volatility that we're seeing in Kabul, I wasn't comfortable going around in the street, even covered in a burqa. I was not comfortable in that situation because there really were no other foreigners in the city at the time, and certainly no reporters going around functioning. However, I do think if you obtain certain permissions for them, they do have exceptions for foreigners, it seems so far. And in Kabul, we're seeing that a little bit where there are foreign journalists, but it really is the Afghans that are the ones that are suffering. The Afghan journalists, the people trying to flee, they're the ones that are basically being targeted. I think foreigners at this point, at least while the US still has a footprint there, are sort of being left alone just by an optics point of view, because the Taliban don't want to be seen as, as targeting the outsider, so to speak. So it's arbitrary. And again, I think there's a big dichotomy between what the leadership is saying and what the rogue elements on the ground are doing. And I just think there are so many factions, and right now, not really a centralized figure that is able to control what is happening. So I think that's just a big disconnect as well. And I don't think that, you certainly can't trust every fighter on the ground the way that the leadership seems to think that they have a control. And so I think that's going to be a big issue for them. But again, they need foreign funding and support to survive. So it's going to be interesting to me to see what kind of concessions they're willing to make.
Do they? How about Qatar? Qatar, the piggy bank, the terrorist piggy bank is available. They can just cut ties with the U.S., implement Sharia law, and become the U.S.'s biggest enemy. And dedicate themselves to fighting U.S. and U.S. assets.
Right. I think what they're craving is a certain type of power or stature that they never got, which is the international recognition. I think, from what I'm understanding, is their ultimate goal would be to be recognized in the UN as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and they want that international recognition. I don't think that their goal is just to be recognized by Qatar and Russia and China. I think they're poising themselves to very carefully position themselves to somehow have that global recognition that they were never able to really receive 20 years ago. And I think we're going to see a little bit of careful maneuvering, at least in the beginning, to kind of get them to that position. And then once they're there, it's sort of, we'll see what happens from there. But I think they're being a little bit more strategic about things at the moment than they were 20 years ago.
And with regard to the people that you're seeing and interviewing on the outskirts of Afghanistan, is Kabul the only exit, or are people making other attempts?
Basically, the Taliban controls every single entry and exit point of the country, which is very challenging for anyone. So people are trying to get out through Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. The border is closed, so it is very difficult. On the night that Mazar fell, a lot of the soldiers fled there. And so as you're going along that road, you just see all the, the armored trucks that the US gave Afghanistan. You see the uniforms, you see the remnants of everything that was kind of dumped. And it's quite chilling. And so but the border is closed to them. I think there was even a situation a few days ago where one of the US planes flown by an Afghan had crashed in Uzbekistan because people were so desperate to leave. So they're finding different ways. People are drowning, trying to cross that river into Tajikistan as well. So it's really heartbreaking. And then, of course, the other points of entry, being Iran, being China, being Pakistan, are all very difficult for Afghans to get through. So it's a difficult situation. There really isn't anywhere to go. And right now, Kabul is the only airspace that's operating. Every other airport has been shut down, and the US is controlling the airport for now. But what happens after that remains to be seen, I think. So it is a real cluster, and people are looking for smuggling routes. I know there are a lot of people sort of setting up these underground railroads, so to speak, to try to get people through Pakistan and other areas. But then the neighboring countries like Uzbekistan obviously have their own security to worry about and have their own security threats. And so they're not willing to kind of take any risks. So it's a really, really precarious situation where people feel very trapped, that they can't get out. And it's a very real feeling, because there really isn't a safe passage or a sort of a friendly country that they can go to necessarily.
Right. I know a lot of your investigative reporting on the ground there has been about the actual evacuations and getting the U.S. and other foreigners out. You did a New York Post piece about the evacuation process, and specifically about the criticism that a lot of these private charters are empty. Can you address that? You mean, why are these planes empty? How would you even assess the evacuation process in total? And does it look like we're going to get this job done by Tuesday?
It's an absolute mess. I can't begin to tell you just how frustrating it's been, and the desperation every half an hour of receiving messages from people who just, I'm at the gate. They've spent sometimes 2 days trying to just physically get to the gate, only to be turned around and told to go home when they get there. So it's problematic from so many different reasons. Things like if people have their spelling incorrect, or the sort of their ethnic spelling on their passport might be different to what they put on a form, and then they're being turned away because the paperwork isn't to a T. And then other people are getting there, and for example, people are being told that they need to be at the gate by 10 a.m. So it may take them 12 hours to get there. And by the time they get there, they've missed that window. Or everybody's being told to go to one gate, as opposed to, there are many gates at that airport that they could be told to go to. And so it's creating a bottleneck in one place that's creating a security problem. They're just little, or not little, I should say, they're large things that just eventuated into being a complete mess. And for example, one of my photographers, one of his good friend's wife, has been trying to get out since Sunday, since the day Kabul fell, more than a week ago, and she's been trying every single day. She's absolutely terrified to get there, and she still has had no luck. And she has all her paperwork ready to go, and physically just cannot get there. And she's a young woman on her own, and she's just petrified. And I just think it's situations like that when escorts need to be arranged for people. People need to be told, and this is something the Brits were actually doing really well from the beginning, was arranging people to be in a safe house at a certain location in a certain time, and we're having a convoy come and physically escort them, because that's really where the bottleneck's coming from. So it's just, and then the other part of the problem is too, you have a lot of Afghans that are just so in fear of their lives that they're going to the airport without any documentation, and they don't have the what's required. And it's also creating a huge mess around the airport as well. So there are just so many factors, and I think it's been really disappointing that the US hasn't really been able to leave the wire. I think that's one thing that our men and women really want to be able to do, is to be able to get these Afghans to safety and get American citizens to safety. Right. And they're just not allowed to do it. Whereas the French and the Brits and the South Africans have all been allowed to kind of physically go out and do it. And really that was what was required from the beginning. There are still thousands of American citizens, I believe, that are still in the country, and not just in Kabul. The problem is people are all over the country. And that's the other thing that isn't really being addressed. How are people getting out of Kandahar? How are they getting out of Herat? Like we that's just not being addressed. It's like you either have to get your way to Kabul, which requires Taliban permissions to drive there. Otherwise you are going to be completely stuck, and that's a big problem. So I don't see mathematically how we're we may be able to get the American citizens out, at least the ones that are in Kabul, by Tuesday. But all the thousands of Afghans that have the SIVs and have the proper paperwork, who supported Americans throughout this occupation, and now they're the ones who I don't see how they're going to be able to get out. So it's been an absolute mess. And I know a lot of people as well that have said, that have raised money to get evacuation planes, that have gotten things donated from different countries, but they're not able to land. So they don't have the required paperwork. The US is controlling the airport. And so you do have a lot of these resources that have just gone to waste because they've been chartered, people have paid for them, and they physically cannot land at the airport.
That's an interesting point in all of this, is that yes, the U.S. does control the airport, but yet the intel that we got overnight, for example, that there would be some sort of attack at the airport, came from the UK. A lot of our intel has come from our European allies with regards to what is moving on the ground and transpiring on the ground. Why all this confusion and chaos? We've been there for 20 years. You said it perfectly in your in the initial question, in that you were there from the beginning of August, and in 2 weeks this unraveled so quickly. Where are the loose threads here that led to such a Mickey Mouse evacuation?
I think it was an absolute disaster, and I think the US obviously completely underestimated the abilities of the Taliban and really overestimated the capabilities of the Afghan security forces. I think closing Bagram back in May was just a huge mistake. I mean, the amount of difference we could have made in keeping that open would have been huge. Instead, what happened was the Taliban took over Bagram and released 7,000 of the most hardened Taliban fighters who'd been at the maximum security wing there. So that just bolstered, of course, the Taliban's ability to hold and capture further areas. So it's just shocking to begin with. I think, in my opinion, is that the corruption within the Afghan government, which really filtered through to the military, was a huge factor in why these cities fell so quickly. What you were looking at was basically the young soldiers being sold out by leadership, by commanders who were cutting deals with the Taliban in advance, getting money, agreeing to hand over the city, fleeing the country to their safe palaces in neighboring nations, and leaving their soldiers basically to slaughter. So when soldiers were finding out, well, their leaders had already left and already surrendered the city, I mean, you can imagine why they didn't want to keep fighting, why they were choosing to drop their weapons and run, because the country they were fighting for no longer existed. That country had sold them out and didn't care about their own lives. And we're seeing that more and more. And the Taliban were very strategic about playing into that. So they were winning the war by sitting in a room, having tea, cutting a deal. They weren't winning the war necessarily out there on the battlefield in a fight. And even in Mazar, the way they took that city, it was without a shot. They just came in. There was zero resistance. And what baffled me was that there was zero air support. There was nothing. And so the air support was the one thing that the US had given the Afghan forces that the Taliban did not have, and yet it was not used. It was not used in any capacity to support them in their fight. And I think the Taliban really played into that, in the sense that as soon as the US announced that withdrawal date, they were able to kind of recede a little bit, lay a bit low. And I think the US had a false sense of security of how strong the Afghan forces were and thought that they were much stronger than they were. I also think we actually had no idea how many people there were in the ANA. I mean, I was hearing numbers where there was 300,000 security forces. I wouldn't be surprised if a good quarter of those at least were soldiers that never existed or had died or just weren't there. So I don't think that the strength in numbers were there. And the Taliban were really able to exploit that by getting insiders, getting defectors, paying for inside attacks. So I just think the US really didn't know what was on its hands. And I don't think the NDS were very good at collecting their intelligence. And even in my case, I was literally on the phone to an NDS person about an hour before Mazar fell, and they were telling me, no, it's not going to fall for about 2 weeks, if that. You know, you'll be fine. I had my flight back to Kabul wasn't going to be for 48 hours, and yet here they are saying, oh no, it's you're fine. Mazar's not going to fall. It's under control, and 40 minutes later, it's done. So I just think we just really overestimated the capabilities of what the Afghans had, and they just they weren't able to give accurate information.
I know you have some high-level sources on the ground there, and I want, what's going through their minds? I mean, think about the people who are from the military, from the government. Obviously, the president was able to escape, but I'm sure the whole top echelon of society there was not able to escape. Do they have X's on their backs? Are they fearful for their lives right now?
I think a lot of them are definitely fearful. I think a lot have left. I mean, a lot of the contacts that I have not heard from. I have tried to send them messages and they aren't even going through. So I can only make the assumption that they've gone to another country or very much in hiding. I think any of the sort of that top echelon that are still safely in Kabul have obviously cut a deal with the Taliban that will enable their safety. Otherwise, I would assume that anyone who hadn't already pre-structured a deal would have long left by now, because certainly X is on their backs, and it's just, I think it's been a lot of inventory that's been done over the past week or so, where Taliban are going door to door collecting information about who is at that house, how many weapons are at that house, what roles people have had, and I think they're collecting that inventory. And it remains to be seen what's going to happen next week. I've also think what's been disappointing too is really the president left and really didn't tell anybody. And I don't believe that any any effort was made to delete files, to sort of hide any sensitive information that might implicate people. And so basically over the past week and a half, the Taliban has really been able to just go into the palace and get whatever data they need from every ministry and have full access to that, and so who knows how that is going to be used at this point.
Yeah, it's tremendous. It's as if they, stocked the fridge and made sure that there are cold beers there. And, in terms of everything, the military as well as the palace and everything else. Now, you have decided to go back from Uzbekistan back into Afghanistan. People would call you masochistic in many ways. Since this explosion that we had today, a lot of people are saying that this is a new and probably final chapter in the U.S.'s evacuation, obviously, but it really draws a line in the sand with regards to the escalation because of these explosions and unfortunately casualties. Does this change your calculus about going back? Are you fearful for your life? What would you anticipate once you head back?
So again, it comes down to a few logistics, which we've been trying to work through. It's been incredibly difficult. Obviously, the situation, everyone's trying to get out. We're trying to get in, but I hope to get back as soon as I can. It may take longer than I would like, but we'll see. I do really believe it's important to tell the story. I think that really this new chapter is only just beginning. And Lisa, I think whilst everything has been really focused on the airport and the chaos at the airport, there are so many things going on behind the scenes in a much bigger picture of what's happening in Afghanistan that we aren't really focusing on because people right now are just so consumed with the airport situation. And there's just so many other things at play that I really feel make a big difference to the United States and to the world that I would like to do justice to as a journalist if I can. So that is really my objective, is looking at that big picture as opposed to the minutia. I've worked in Afghanistan. I mean, last time I was here in 2017, there were just multiple suicide bombings, including one right near my compound that killed 180 people. So in some ways, I think even Afghanistan isn't even as high threat, perhaps, now than it was in the past, because a lot of those bombings were being orchestrated by ISIS, but also the Taliban, which I think the Taliban has stopped a lot of their own sort of suicide attacks at this point, because they are trying to herald themselves as the winners and the sort of the peace providers, if you will. So in those sort of attacks, I mean, obviously you always have to be very mindful of them, but in some ways the country seems a little even less volatile in that sense than it did several years ago, when you were just, it was a constant day. Every day there was a suicide bombing. Every day there was
and arbitrary
a car bomb,
too.
Yeah. So in some ways, I think that the actual level of violence has probably gone down a little bit. And you always have to weigh up the risk. You should always have a healthy dose of fear. I don't think anyone should be doing this work if they are completely fearless, because that's not really a smart headspace to be in. I think you have to have your bearings about you. But I really believe in the story. I really believe in not just allowing, I guess, sort of a blackout on the situation. I think that the Afghans deserve better than that, and they deserve their story to be told as accurately as possible. And the only way to do that is to kind of really be there, I think.
Wonderful. I mean, and we will keep telling their story. And I encourage you all to go to HollieMcKay.com to read her work. Be safe, Hollie. We are with you. We are extending our prayers to you and the people of Afghanistan to safely, navigate these new waters. And hopefully we'll have you back on, or at least we'll get you on the phone next week to hear about your trip back to Afghanistan. Again, be safe travels to you and your team. And we really appreciate all the work that you're doing. And we hope to echo the voices and the sentiments of the people of Afghanistan in this very, very difficult hour. To all of you at home, thank you so much for joining us. We will continue our coverage of Afghanistan on foreigndesknews.com. To subscribe to our daily email, go to our website and you can sign up there. And to subscribe to our weekly podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari and you can sign up there. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.